Okay. So we just have a few slides left in the chapter on joints. The last big joint I was going to talk about is the ankle joint. So that's our last synovial joint that I'm going through specifically. And then I'll talk a little bit about arthritis and then get into, we'll start the muscle tissue chapter today as well. So this last joint I'm going to talk about, obviously we worked our way down the body, right? We started at the jaw and then went to the, the shoulder, the elbow, hip, knee. Now we're down at the ankle. So the ankle holds a lot of weight, right? As we slowly move down the body, we're just putting more and more body weight on these synovial joints. So the ankle joint can have quite a few issues, even if it's not necessarily overused or injured during sports. Just over a lifetime, there can be some significant issues with the ankle joint. So the technical term for it is the talocrural joint. That just refers to the talus, which is the bone, one of the bones on the top of your foot, basically at your ankle, the tarsal bone. So the talus and then the crural region of your leg is that lower region, so the lower leg. So talocrural is your ankle joint. It actually has two articulations because you have two bones in your lower leg, right? You have the tibia and the fibula. Both of those are articulating with the talus. So the medial joint is going to be your tibia because your tibia is medial. It's on the inside of your leg. So the medial one is the tibia and talus. The lateral joint is going to be the fibula and the talus. So two bones joining the talus. I've mentioned the malleoli of the tibia and the fibula in lab, and I think in here as well. But these are what we think of as our ankle bones, the little pieces that jut out at the bottom of our leg. So those are the malleoli. You have a medial and a lateral, depending on whether it's on the tibia or the fibula, just like the joints. So the medial malleolus is up here on the inside of your leg. That is going to be on the tibia. The lateral malleolus is just a piece that kind of sticks out a little bit on the fibula. So for you guys on Zoom, here's the medial malleolus and the lateral malleolus. The point of those bones kind of extending down and sticking out a little bit is to help secure the ankle from a side-to-side point of view. So the ankle doesn't necessarily roll or rock too much from side to side. Those kind of extensions of the tibia and the fibula help to secure that side-to-side, limit that side-to-side motion. Okay. So those are the bones essentially of the ankle joint. There's a few ligaments that you'll need to know. So the important ligaments, you have, again, a medial and lateral, right, on the inside as well as the outside. The medial ligament is also called the deltoid ligament. It's going to bind the tibia to the talus. The lateral or collateral ligament is going to bind the fibia to the talus. So lots of medial and lateral here because we're talking about those two bones. Another very important one that I mentioned in lab is the calcaneal tendon or the Achilles tendon. So that is the tendon that's coming off the back of your heel. Here they have it labeled as calcaneal tendon, but we more commonly call it the Achilles tendon. So it extends from the calcaneus, which is your heel bone, up into the calf muscle. It's a pretty big ligament, and obviously really important for stability in the foot and ankle region. So those are the three ligaments that are kind of helping secure the ankle in the back and then on either side. If you get a sprain, you've basically torn at least even a small tear. You've torn a ligament or a tendon, and sprains in the ankle are very common just because we have a lot of weight on the ankle. If it rolls a little bit in the wrong direction, you can easily tear one of those ligaments or tendons. So sprains are probably the most common injury to the ankle. That pretty much wraps up the ankle joint. I'm not going to go into any more detail about it. And that is the end of all of those the main synovial joints of our body, the synovial joints that give us the most issues, essentially, that get injured the most often. Okay. Any questions about that stuff? Okay. So now I just want to talk briefly about arthritis. We can't really talk about joints without talking about arthritis. So this is just, arthritis is a very general term. There's multiple kinds of arthritis. It's a general term that refers to any kind of inflammation of the joints. So irritation, inflammation, long-term or short-term, potentially, of joints. Typically, you see it in older adults, just because they've been using their joints for a lot longer, and there's a lot more wear and tear on them. It's said to be the most common crippling disease in the United States. So it leads to a lot of issues with movement in older individuals. People who study arthritis specifically and other joint disorders, but primarily arthritis, are called rheumatologists. So this is enough of an issue that there is kind of a whole part of medicine actually dedicated to just the study of joint disorders, in particular arthritis. And I'm going to talk about two of the main kinds of arthritis, osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. I think there's a group in here doing an arthritis video, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. This will just kind of be an overview, and then they'll give you more info on that in their disease video. So osteoarthritis is what we think of that people get as they get older. It's called wear and tear arthritis. It's just from using your joints over and over and over again for decades. Essentially what happens, the articular cartilage starts to break down and degenerate. So when I was talking about how exercise and actually using your joints is helpful, it can help prevent arthritis because it will keep that articular cartilage in better shape for longer. So if you don't use your joints, you're more likely to develop early onset arthritis because you're not supplying that cartilage with nutrients and oxygen on a regular basis. So without that, it degenerates a lot faster. As a result of the articular cartilage kind of breaking down, bone will rub on bone a little bit more often. And over time, that can lead to the development of bone spurs. And bone spurs are just kind of little projections or like extra growth of bone. And then when muscles and tendons move over those projections that aren't supposed to be there, they can cause a lot of pain. So osteoarthritis, kind of the typical arthritis that you think of that, you know, maybe your grandparents have or something. Most of us will likely develop some kind of osteoarthritis, hopefully as we get way, way older, but it's just due to using your joints, which is, you know, it's a good thing. Osteoarthritis is not, but using your joints is a good thing. Okay, on to rheumatoid arthritis. You've probably heard of rheumatoid arthritis, but maybe don't know a lot about it. I feel like I see a lot of commercials for drugs that help with rheumatoid arthritis. That's where I usually hear about it. This is actually an autoimmune disease. So this isn't only in older people. It can be in younger people as well. And it's where the immune system is essentially attacking the joints. So a person's individual immune system, like any autoimmune disorder, is attacking its own body. So how I've described it here, basically misguided antibodies are attacking the synovial membrane. So the membrane within that joint capsule, breaking it down, synovial fluid is degrading, and that synovial fluid is really important for lubrication within the joint. So the membrane, the synovial fluid are all kind of degrading along with the cartilage. So it can be really, really painful, especially as the joint or joints begin to ossify. And joints ossifying basically means joints that are solidifying into, you can almost think of it as like one continuous bone without, so if you think of your knuckle maybe, or this person's knuckles here, rather than having that synovial, the cavity, the joint cavity within, it ends up almost being immovable, like it's one continuous bone across that joint. So that's what the ossification aspect is. So it makes it very painful to move your joints. Remissions can occur throughout a person's life. So like a lot of autoimmune diseases, this can kind of come and go sort of unexpectedly. There's a lot of treatments for it, but there's no cure necessarily. Autoimmune diseases are particularly hard to cure because we don't want to knock out the immune system totally. The idea is to target any of the misguided antibodies, ideally, but that's easier said than done. So steroids, aspirin, kind of just dealing with the symptoms can help sort of bring the inflammation down and decrease pain. So that is rheumatoid arthritis. And this last slide is really just because there's a lot of research in this area now with artificial joints. A lot of people get their joints replaced, especially as they get older. So hip replacements, knee replacements, shoulder replacements, those are all extremely common, especially hip and knee. So hip and knee replacements happen quite frequently these days. The term for replacement of joints basically that aren't working with an artificial device is called arthroplasty. So it's pretty amazing what they can do. This will be a knee that's being replaced. You can see kind of the femur and then the lower part of the leg. And here within the actual bone, you can see how it would fit together with these metal and I guess it kind of looks like plastic, but I'm sure it's not plastic pieces. And then this over here is basically a fake head of a femur. So if you ever get your hip replaced, or if you've had like grandparents or parents who have had their hips replaced, they'll cut off the head of the femur. So they cut off the head of the individual's femur and then essentially attach a fake head of the femur to it and then put in an acetabulum as well into the hip. So they have a completely false kind of ending of the bone and then new hip socket. So the actual hip fits together better and works better compared to how it did when it was injured before. And interestingly, nowadays that's an outpatient procedure. So you can have the head of your femur cut off, a new head of the femur put on, inserted back into the hip socket, and you're out of the hospital that same day. You're up and moving, ideally almost right after surgery. So it's pretty amazing how far the technology has come, and technology is always moving faster than I expect it to, but technology in this area has really come a long way. All right, that's the end of chapter 9, the joints chapter. Has anyone had like parents or grandparents who have had knees and hips replaced? Yeah, someone in the last class, I think her mom had her hip replaced. So yeah, it's extremely common. All right, now we're gonna switch. Let's pull the next chapter up. Muscle tissue. Okay. So like I said, we are switching orders here. So this is going to be chapter 11. We'll go back and do chapter 10, which is the skeletal system after this. So we're going to talk about the muscle tissue that actually makes up the muscles before we talk about all the muscles that you need to know. Okay. Oops. So this intro slide is sort of pointless. I don't know why I left it in here. But it's important in general to understand how muscles are working. We're going to go pretty small, so like into the subcellular level to understand how muscles actually contract and relax. So it's going to get into pretty fine detail in this chapter. If you're really good at understanding kind of physiology and how things work together, this is going to be a great chapter for you. If you're not as good at that, you might have to work a little bit harder at understanding this. It's a little difficult to wrap your head around. I have some helpful kind of animation type videos that I think do a good job of explaining this process of muscle contraction, but you're going to know a lot about the process of muscle contraction after this, hopefully. As a reminder, there's 3 types of muscular tissue. So you have the skeletal, the cardiac, and the smooth. For the vast majority of this, I'm focusing on skeletal muscle. So think of it as the muscle that you usually think about. I think I have about 5 slides on cardiac and smooth muscle combined, and just talking about the differences, how they differ in contraction type stuff from skeletal muscle. Okay, so let's jump in. As a reminder, skeletal muscle is voluntary. We decide when we want it to contract for the most part. You might have cramps or twitches, which are not necessarily conscious, but for the most part, we can control when our skeletal muscles contract. So it's voluntary and it's striated. So the striations are one of the main characteristics of skeletal muscle. And these are actually due to proteins in there that are contracting those sections in between the striations. So those lines are where the muscle is contracting. So a bunch of those in a row are going to lead to a full-on muscle contraction. And then terminology. So you're going to see a lot of myo this and myo that. There's a lot of muscle specific terms. So they have some special names for like the plasma membrane, the endoplasmic reticulum. There's special names for all of that stuff. So I'm going to go through a lot of terminology here at the beginning. And as I use those terms, I'll try to remind you what they mean. Like when I talk about a myofiber, that is a muscle cell. So I'll try to keep referring back to kind of the more common term that you guys are hopefully familiar with. But as we get into this, you'll hear more of these kind of unique terms that deal only with muscles. Okay, so a muscle cell, one cell, if you remember, skeletal muscle cells can be really long, and they can be up to 30 centimeters long, actually. So one cell can be 30 centimeters long, which is kind of bizarre to think about. Muscle cells are referred to as muscle fibers or myofibers. So anytime you see myo, that means muscle. Like I said, you're going to see a lot of myo this and myo that. So a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. So that's one of the biggest ones. You'll hear muscle fiber or myofiber many times throughout this chapter. And I'm going to go into what is called the structural hierarchy of muscle, of a skeletal muscle specifically. So muscles are sort of bundles within bundles within bundles. So I'm going to kind of detail what these different bundles are all the way down to these individual proteins that allow for contraction. So we're going to start at the highest level, so the biggest. So we'll imagine a muscle, like the quadricep muscle in the front of your leg or hamstring, whatever you want to think of. You have the overall muscle. Those muscles, if you go one layer down, are made up of fascicles. Fascicles are basically bundles of muscle cells or muscle fibers. So you have a bunch of muscle cells bound together in fascicles, like here. Those fascicles are all bound together into what we think of as a muscle. So here you have the fascicles for you guys on Zoom. Within each of those fascicles, there are multiple muscle fibers or muscle cells. Muscle cells are weird in that they're not like the typical cell that you think of where there's all this like goopy cytoplasm and a few organelles spread throughout it. They are jam-packed full of what we call myofibrils. And that's, I've defined myofibrils on the next slide. But if you look at this, this is one muscle cell. So this long muscle cell, right? With the coating on the outside, which I'll talk about. Oh, where are we? There we go. So this is one muscle cell and it's jam-packed with these myofibrils. There's not a lot of place for cytoplasm, and all the other organelles are kind of smushed up against the sides. So it's a uniquely structured cell, to say the least. All right, so that's our, so here we're at one cell. We're gonna go subcellular now into a single cell and look at what are called myofibrils. So myofiber and myofibril, those are really confusing terms. Just remember, myofiber is the cell. Myofibrils are the pieces within the cell. Super easy to get confused. So myofibrils are essentially a bunch of protein filaments packed together. So like I said, we have bundles within bundles within bundles. So these myofibrils are kind of one of the last bundles that we're dealing with. So within these myofibrils inside a cell, you have a bunch of protein filaments. The protein filaments are what we're going to look at that are actually moving to contract the muscle. So I'm going to skip over sarcomere here, go down to myofilaments. The myofilaments are the protein strands that are moving to contract the muscle. Myofilament is the finest level of detail we're going to get into. So there's no more slides on the hierarchy of skeletal muscle here. These myofilaments are made of myosin and actin, which may sound familiar to you. So they're proteins that are often involved in movement in a lot of different organisms, different parts of organisms. So yeah, myosin and actin are just proteins, and we'll go into more detail on them. So I'm going to spend a good amount of time talking about these specific myofilaments, the myosin and the actin. If we go back up one level, a sarcomere is just a stretch of those. So a specific contractile unit is a sarcomere. So when these actually move past one another to contract the muscle, that happens within these units called sarcomeres. And then there's another sarcomere here, sarcomere over here, that will also lead to that contraction. So all of those put together end up making the muscle contract. Okay, so for you guys on Zoom, this is going to be the myosin and the actin filaments. And then the sarcomeres between these Z discs, which I'll get into more detail on that in a bit. All right, so that's how a muscle cell, well, a muscle organ overall is structured. Like I said, we're going to focus at the subcellular level for a while here. So imagine being within a muscle cell. Oh, right, the connective tissue wrappings. So just like on bone tissue, there was the periosteum and the endosteum, those kind of protective wrappings around different parts of the bone. Skeletal muscle has that as well. There's 3 different levels at different stages of the hierarchy that I just talked about. So we'll start with epimysium on the bottom here. So epi means on top of. Epimysium is the connective tissue that wraps around the entire muscle. So if you're thinking of a quadricep muscle, it is wrapping around the entire muscle, the entire quadricep muscle. That's the epimysium. And it's holding everything together. So these connective tissues are just kind of holding everything in place at these different levels of structure. If we go one level down, the paramysium is wrapping these fascicles. And remember, the fascicles are just bundles of cells. So a bunch of cells bundled together is a fascicle. The paramecium is wrapping around that bundle and keeping it together, keeping the fascicle together. And then finally, the endomesium is just the connective tissue wrapping around one muscle cell or muscle fiber. So here you can see the endomesium around one of those cells in one of those fascicles right there. Okay. So that's how we kind of hold all of this sort of complicated structural hierarchy together through those connective tissue wrappings. Okay, so some other pieces within the cell. Like I said, muscle fibers have different terms for different pieces of the cell, which makes it so much more fun to learn. Rather than the plasma membrane, it's called the sarcolemma. So it's still just the membrane around the cell. So here we have one muscle fiber or cell. So this whole thing, remember it has a bundle of, or it has a bunch of myofibrils inside of it. So the sarcolemma is the membrane around that cell. The sarcoplasm is essentially the cytoplasm, so just the liquidy filling within the cell. There is not a lot of sarcoplasm within a muscle cell. You can see it's basically jam-packed full of these microfibrils. There's not a lot of empty space for the sarcoplasm. There is some, it's, you know, surrounding those bunches of myofibrils, but there's basically not a lot of empty space in these muscle cells. This is a little bit repetitive, but it's probably not a bad thing to be a little repetitive in this part of the chapter, just to remind you of the different parts of these muscle cells. So myofibrils are these long protein cords, like I said, that are occupying most of the space within one cell. So here we have a bunch of myofibrils. Those are divided into those segments called sarcomeres. The sarcomere is what actually contracts. Okay. You'll see all of these terms again. And like I said, I'll try to remind you of what they mean, like the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane, etc. All right, continuing on with still just looking at one cell, one muscle fiber. There are multiple nuclei within or along the side, essentially, of one cell. So the nuclei are kind of smashed along the edge. There's not a lot of space in the middle of the cell. Like I said, it's all taken up by those myofibrils. So the nucleus is forced to just kind of be smashed up against the sarcolemma, sorry, against that cell membrane. So it's mushed up against the side, which we saw on some slides of skeletal muscle. Okay, mitochondria. Mitochondria make ATP, right, during cellular respiration. Muscles need a lot of ATP. That's the energy currency of cells. Muscles need a lot of energy. Thus, they need a lot of ATP, so they have a lot of mitochondria. And here you can see the mitochondria kind of scattered in between those myofibrils. So here you have multiple mitochondria just kind of fitting in wherever they can. Again, there's not like a bunch of empty space in this cell, so they kind of fit in between the myofibrils as best they can. Okay, and then another sarco term. You guys remember the endoplasmic reticulum, hopefully from a general cell. In a muscle cell, it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it forms this, what looks like kind of a net on the outside of these myofibrils. So that's that purple net looking stuff on the outside of the myofibrils here. That's sarcoplasmic reticulum. We didn't talk a whole lot about endoplasmic reticulum, and it hasn't really come up in any of the other tissues, but it's really important in muscle cells, primarily because that's where calcium is stored. So it's an important calcium ion reservoir. And calcium is critical for muscle contraction. And we'll talk about why. There's a lot of ions flowing during muscle contraction. Calcium is one of them. So that'll come into play in a big way, but I won't get into that right now. Anyway, sarcoplasmic reticulum, that's where the calcium's found. We need calcium for the contraction process. And then the final term I have on here is the transverse or T tubules. And it doesn't really show up well on this diagram, but they're just infoldings into the interior of the cell. So infoldings of the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane folds in and kind of works its way down into the myofibrils as like a little pathway, basically for the calcium to get in. So infoldings of the sarcolemma, yeah, so there's this little hole here that represents the T tubule. We'll see some other images of that and a video that will hopefully do a better job at describing what those actually look like, but they're just kind of pathways into the myofibril. Okay, I think that maybe wraps up the terminology stuff. Yeah. So here's just another image, if this is helpful for you, of a diagram of a muscle fiber. So it kind of gives you all the same pieces, just a slightly different view, kind of more from above, rather than just a cross section like I was showing you. All right. So now we're going to get into those myofilaments, those really the lowest down structure that I talked about on that hierarchy. So those myofibrils that are taking up most of the space in the cell, in the muscle fiber, have a bunch of myofilaments in them. They're made up of myofilaments. Myofilaments are the contractile elements. So you have a couple of different types of filaments that will bond with each other and lead to contraction. So this is where we're actually getting into the kind of finest detail of the contraction aspect. You have what are called thick filaments, which are the myosin. Myosin and actin, I think I said this already, are just proteins, right? So one myosin molecule looks kind of like this, a twisted tail with a kind of globular club-shaped head. That's myosin. And a bunch of those bonded together like this on the bottom here form what we call a thick filament. So it's just a bunch of myosin molecules stuck together. And then we have, it's on the next slide. So that's myosin, that's the thick filament. We also have thin filaments. Which are made up of actin, another protein. And this is just two strands of what they call G subunits. It's not really all that important. It'll come up briefly again, but globular actin subunits. So two of those twisted together make up a thin filament. So here we have these red spheres are the two pieces of that actin filament coming together. So actin is a thin filament, and then actin also has a couple other special pieces on top of it. It has something called tropomyosin and troponin. Again, two really similar sounding terms. This bluish white strand looking thing here is tropomyosin. So you have your tropomyosin. And that is essentially covering what are called active sites on the actin. And the active sites are where the myosin molecule is going to bind to the actin molecule to create a contraction. So when tropomyosin is in place, this would be like a resting muscle. it's covering the active sites so that that bonding between myosin and actin can't happen and there's no contraction. So how do we get that tropomyosin off of the active sites so we can have that bonding? That's where the troponin comes in. So there's these little weirdly shaped troponin molecules here. And this is where calcium comes into play. When calcium binds to these, the troponin, that's going to move the tropomyosin and expose the active sites. So when a bunch of calcium flows towards this thin filament, it'll bind to the troponin. That'll make the tropomyosin shift, and you get binding between the thick and thin filaments, and that's contraction. I have this in detail on more slides, and I have some videos. So if you didn't quite get that, don't stress about it too much right now. But that's the idea. So that's why tropomyosin and troponin are particularly important on this actin. All right, so we're going to look at a really quick video of how these myosin and actin filaments actually kind of bond together and lead to contraction. Let me let you guys just see the screen here. Okay. So this is a really simple animation, but I think it does a nice job of kind of showing the generally what's happening when we get a muscle contraction at this really, really tiny, fine detail level. Oh, come on. It was working before. Oh, come on. Okay, maybe we'll have to do this on Monday. All right. Why do things change between classes? Great. Okay, never mind. That's super annoying. I'll show you the video on Monday and I'll get the sound figured out. Yeah, so we'll pick up with that on Monday and continue on with muscle tissue.